Dr. Brenda Green, Executive Director of the Center for Black Literature and Director of the National Black Writers Conference at Medgar Evers College. Writers on Writing comes to you each Sunday evening and gives you, our listeners, an opportunity to hear writers from the African diaspora talk about their work, their craft, and their lives. I'm really, really pleased to have with me on the telephone this evening Rosemari Mealy. Welcome, Rosemari.
Oh, thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me to come on your program.
Well, it's really a delight to have you, and your latest book, The Reprinting of Fidel and Malcolm X, is a very important work. Before we get into that, I'd just like to share with our listening audience who Rosemari Mealy is. She is adjunct assistant professor at City College, CUNY, and works at the Center for Worker Education. She's been honored for her community involvement on numerous occasions and was the recipient of the Claudia Jones Fellow in the Africa New World Studies program at Florida International University. She has lived and worked in Cuba, where she collaborated on several projects in support of U.S. political prisoners. And she's also an activist in the international human rights and political prisoner movement. She is a woman, an activist, a leader who has been involved in this work for, I should say, several decades, right?
Yep, we can put it like that. Yes, I'm proud of that. We're still alive and walking on earth, doing our work.
That's right. You're still doing the work, still involved in the struggle. So you had the reprinting, Black Classic Press reprinted Fidel and Malcolm X, Memories of a Meeting. And of course, we'll share with the audience that not only was the reprinting launched at the anniversary celebration of Black Classic Press, but it was also launched at the International Book Fair in Havana, Cuba. And so why don't you share with our audience what the inspiration was for writing this book, Fidel and Malcolm X, Memories of a Meeting?
Okay, well, thanks, Brenda, so much. Actually, the interest really came out of my own interest. For years, I had heard about the meeting, but whenever I would try to find information about it, I couldn't find any books that really put into context the significance of the meeting. So the reliance, as most people would be, on news clippings and maybe go to YouTube and you would see Fidel Castro in 1960 speaking at the UN General Assembly. So this was like an interest and a concern that I had as a student, and then later years in my own college career, trying to put together this meeting. I was very interested in it. And of course, having, as you mentioned, I had an opportunity more than almost 40 years ago to go to Cuba. And, people would talk about this meeting between Fidel and Malcolm X, and I could only reference, from my perspective, the limited amount of information that I had. However, in 1990, Casa de las Americas, which is like one of the main cultural centers in Havana, called for a conference, and actually the title was Malcolm Speaks in the 90s, because as you can recall, and as some of the listeners can recall, and even some of the young people who are listening, there was an upsurge in interest in Malcolm X, and a lot of it was made into a commodity with Malcolm X T-shirts and things like that. But on the positive side, a lot of young artists were singing about Malcolm, rapping about Malcolm, and what have you. So in May of 1990, when this conference took place, it was like really an ideal time, not only for people in the United States, scholars and writers and what have you, to come together, but it was an international conference where scholars, writers, and activists from all over the world came together and actually presented papers and discussed the life of Malcolm X. And so, you really realize once you leave this place that the broadness of people's knowledge is just so far-reaching and surprising a lot of times of the topics and interests that people abroad have about our own heroes and heroines. So out of the conference was actually a great success. Was like a whole almost a week actually, and then after the conference, the official parts of the presentation, the delegation had an opportunity to actually be called one evening where Fidel Castro actually came and met with the delegation. And this was an amazing experience for many people, because what he did, he not only welcomed us to the conference, but his knowledge about Malcolm was just amazing. I mean, he knew about the autobiography, he'd read it, and as a matter of fact, the autobiography of Malcolm X had been published in Spanish in Cuba. So there were young people and scholars on the island who knew about it. So after the and also at the conference, several of the individuals who had accompanied Fidel when he came to New York in 1960 and eventually ended up in Harlem, they were actually there themselves, and they were able to also provide those of us who attended the conference with their reflections on what it was like to have met Malcolm and to have been in his presence.
Right. So just to put a pin on that for a moment, we'll come back to that. But there are people in our audience who really don't have the background knowledge about that meeting that took place in 1960. Can you provide the context for Fidel meeting Malcolm? I even learned more in reading this book about what actually happened and the dynamics.
Oh, I'd be glad to. Well, the chronology, goes all the way back to 1952 when the military coup in Cuba, and ultimately we move up to 1953 when Fidel Castro and the revolutionaries actually took over an army barracks, and that actually began the beginnings of what was known as the July 26th movement. So eventually that movement continued until January 1st, 1959, when the revolutionary forces led by Fidel assumed control in Havana, and history tells us that was the culmination yet the beginning of the Cuban Revolution. So initially, the United States recognized the Cuban government, but as time went on, the word went out that this was a quote-unquote communist country. The country was moving towards communism, and the hostilities towards Cuba changed. It shifted tremendously. Fidel been invited in 1960 to come to the United States to the 15th session of the General Assembly of the United Nations. So when he was greeted at the airport, people came out supporting that, and they ended up being booked into what was then and still is now the Shelburne Hotel, which is around the same area where the Cuban Mission to the United Nations is located in Midtown Manhattan. However, the owners of the hotel demanded this astronomical fee that in order for the Cubans to stay into the hotel, and they balked at that. They felt that as a legitimate government that they were being hijacked, and so they refused to pay the accommodations, and so they were eventually ousted from the hotel. And when that happened, Fidel threatened to set up tents on the campus of the United Nations. Well, you can imagine what kind of international uproar that could have been. Meanwhile, there are progressive folks in New York who feel differently and respect, the Cuban Revolution, and they love Fidel. And so a group of our black folk in Harlem got together, and Malcolm X was a part of this welcoming committee. And so along with other dignitaries and leaders in the Harlem community, they extended an invitation to the Cuban delegation. And that's how the Cuban delegation winded up coming to the Hotel Teresa, which, by the way, was owned by a black man at that time, Mr. W.O.W. Woods. And they came up to Harlem, so they moved they shifted the gears in a sense, and they were welcomed. I mean, and that meant that all of the international delegates who came to the UN conference, they ended up having to come to Harlem to see Fidel. So on September 16th is actually a very historical date, because Fidel accepts the invitation to come to, September 19th, 1960. Fidel accepts the invitation. The delegation arrives in Harlem. There's a meeting. And so, believe it or not, when Fidel and Malcolm actually met that evening at the Hotel Teresa, it was a brief meeting, but it was significant because, as I've said and as other scholars have noted, this was the beginning of kind of like the kind of consolidation of the solidarity between the African American people and the Cuban Revolution. The meeting was brief, as my book states. They had these pleasantries where Malcolm said to Fidel, and I paraphrase, "You've done everything in your country that our struggle is about here and that we have to do." And Malcolm warned Fidel about the tenacity or the way in which this government operates, and he warned him that he'd better be aware of any kind of trickery that may be down the sleeves of the Eisenhower administration at the time or anybody else who was about to in their attempts to overthrow the revolution. And so that meeting was, as I said, it was a brief meeting, but the exchange that occurred was quite profound, and that's noted in the book. Fidel invited Malcolm to come to Havana himself so that he could see what was going on in the country with agrarian reform, the development, ending illiteracy, all the things that we were struggling for in this country, the whole issue around equity and dealing with issues of inequality, land reform, etc. And so, as I said, Malcolm never got an opportunity to go to see that for himself. But that's in essence what happened. I mean, that established that kind of unity between those two leaders that transpires even today, as with the delegation that you were on recently that went to Cuba of black publishers and writers. And you can see the kind of acceptance and how happy and excited people are when African Americans come to Cuba. And they always use that reference point, as you heard when you traveled around a Fidel meeting with Malcolm X.
That's right. So, you talked about the synergy between Malcolm X and Fidel, and what really brings this book to life is listening to other people talk about Malcolm X, reflect on Malcolm X, reflect on Fidel, and the impact that they had on the movement. Can you share any of that? I was really the essay that really got me was the one by Amiri Baraka.
Yes. Well, see what had happened. Mealy Baraka, who then was Leroy Jones, actually that delegation had gone to Cuba right in the midst of the revolution, and he wrote a piece called "Cuba Libre," Cuba Free, and that occurred in July of 1960 when that delegation went to Cuba. So in putting the book together, Amiri was alive then. And he knew about this project, and I asked him if I could use his essay as a way to contextualize, what we had done at the 1990 conference, and he said, of course. And that's why you that important essay is in the book. The essay reminds me of much of what we heard and what we read and we saw when we were there, because that essay really describes the kind of enthusiasm that existed in 1960 at the triumph of the revolution and what has transpired over the past 50-some years. I think that the way in which he describes, he meaning Amiri Baraka, describes going to the mountains, the Sierra Maestro Mountains, where the guerrilla movement actually took place. That's where they were housed in those mountains, and they were able to stretch out into those mountains and organize peasants and farmers. And he describes it so eloquently. And so when we traveled, and then when they came back into Havana, the kind of enthusiasm. And so when we traveled there today, we see that same kind of enthusiasm. We didn't get to the Sierra Maestros when we went to Cuba this time, but certainly other parts of the island that we went through, that same kind of enthusiasm exists among the people today, because it's something that they have, that they can claim. And when you can claim your own nation and your own future and have self-determination, I mean, that is the essence of what all of humanity is striving for. And I think that Miri's essay reflects that for us, and it's also a good piece of history to read. as you bring up, to contextualize what has happened since that time, since 1960 into 2019 today.
Right. So as I said, that really had an impact on me. But and we go back to the other writers. You had Alambe Brath, so many people who are no longer with us, and Sarah Wright,
Yes.
reflecting their reflections on the book. So you had a nice cross section of people reflecting.
Well, that was a real challenge. You can believe that, because
Yes.
when if I may add, when I returned and when I was asked to put this book together, I didn't have very much time. I only had the commitment of a small publishing house out of Australia, who agreed to publish the manuscript. But the challenge for me in 2 to 3 months was, how do I assemble all these people together who had actually been a part of this history? And I must say that Alambe Brath, who was so important to our struggle, he kind of paved the way for me. You know, he would give me the names of people that I should contact, and all the people who these were all interviews. And so my whole approach to doing the book, I wanted to make sure that their voices and their words were heard, and I basically introduced the interviews that I had, and of course, editing them down. I don't think I still did justice to a lot of what they had to share and what they had to say, but it's there, and it's history, and just like you said, I would say that almost 90% of the people who are in the book have made their transition. So this is a history that we can pass on.
That's very important. What has been the reception of the book in the U.S., and how would you recommend that it be used? And then, of course, in Havana.
Well, the reception in the U.S., actually the book first came out in 93, and as I said, by this small publishing house in Australia. It did not get did not get very good distribution to begin with. So it was out of print for almost 20 years. But in the meantime, during that time, I would get letters from colleges and universities where instructors were adapting the book as a part of their courses. I know that San Francisco State in the diaspora studies, I think it is, particularly with the Arab American Studies Department, they use this book every year. And then there are places in England and abroad that I will hear from. And so I know that the book, even when it was out of print, it was still people were still making copies and letting me know this. And then, of course, when the book went back, and when I got the new publisher, Black Classic Press, when they published it, it's my understanding that it's been a very, very important book at one of their titles. It was very important during the time, I understand, when President Obama made his trip to Cuba. Everybody was interested. Suddenly, the whole idea of Cuba, came out of the dark and was back in the light again. Right. So I understand that the book received a lot of people were, looking to find out more information. So that was very important. The book was unofficially translated into Spanish, and I say unofficially because it was done by a school about an Afrocentric bilingual immersion school out of Maryland, the Maryland International Day School, where my granddaughter went, and the director of the school freed up her entire Spanish language teachers to do an unofficial translation of the book. So that happened, and that was important. Now, the dream was to get the book published in Cuba so that Cubans could have access to it. And of course, that's why this last book fair was so important, because we have now an official translation of the book by one of the Cuba's major publishing houses, Letras Cubanas. And that means that not only now is that book going to be able to be distributed in Cuba, but it will also be distributed from the Cuban press in other parts of Latin America and other places. unfortunately, because of the United States blockade against Cuba, which has been there since we talked about it for more than 50 years, the book cannot be sold in this country. So that means that if there are listeners who are Spanish-speaking or they want to have a copy of Fidel and Malcolm X Memorias de un Encuentro, they can't get it here because it cannot be sold here. But they can get the English edition by contacting, I know this is a public radio station, so I don't give out any cost, but they can contact Black Classic Press here in Baltimore, and they will be able to get a copy. It's also an e-book, so that means that if young people who are really into e-books, students who are into e-books, they can actually get it as an e-book format.
Well, thank you so much. Now, you are continuing, as I said earlier, your work as a journalist, and you led a really important delegation of Black writers and publishers to Havana, and I was really impressed and thought that maybe the future might get brighter. It was unfortunate that we still have no embassy really there, but share with us what's going on now in Cuba and what your future projects are.
Well, Cuba is still evolving. I mean, they just had an election a little over a week ago where they had a referendum. They approved the new constitution, which has some very progressive and positive elements about it. People went to the polls. A high number of people went to the polls and they voted. The country, as you saw, people are trying to develop some of the small industries with restaurants and some small private corporations. So that kind of opening is occurring, and people want to change their lifestyle. They want to live, and it's this blockade that you can't trade with this country, or any country that attempts to trade with Cuba gets penalized. So, but in the meantime, there's hope, and they have international solidarity. As you saw, everybody is there. People from all over the world are there. But one of the major concerns now, which may impact us wanting to travel there, we can only travel there under 12 categories, and one of them being it's a people-to-people category. And so you go with a group, you have a program, and so that's a category that you can still travel under. But if I might briefly say, one horrible thing that has occurred over the past week or so is that there is something called the Helms-Burton Bill, and under the Trump administration, they're now going to attempt to reinforce this bill, which means that it's all about attempting to file lawsuits by companies and individuals who own property in Cuba. So Cubans would be forced to return or reimburse or pay to U.S. claimants for the houses that they live in, the areas where their communities are, the churches, the arable land where they're farming, and this is just an incredible thing that under the Trump administration they want to reinforce this. And the United States State Department announced, the decision to allow, starting March 19, the filing of these lawsuits before U.S. courts and Title III, of what's known as the Helms-Burton Act, only against Cuban companies included in the list of restricted entities, as they say. But this is going to cause things to be caught up in the courts, and it's just another way to undermine a country that's attempting to build its own destiny, to direct its own destiny. And of course, I think a lot has to do with the fact that Cuba is in solidarity with Venezuela, and we know what's going on there. And this could have devastating impact, of course, on companies that other foreign subsidiaries that have investments in Cuba, joint ventures in Cuba. So I think it's something that people in this country really need to be aware of, and that we have to struggle against, because these are our friends, these are our neighbors. Whatever criticisms you may have of the Cuban Revolution, as Malcolm said, they have free education, they have health care, and they have food. And if something's wrong with that, then I think that we need to rethink what our principles are and what our beliefs are.
Oh, that is an excellent way to end this. this struggle still continues. I encourage our listening audience to go out and purchase Fidel and Malcolm X, Memories of a Meeting. You can get that again through Black Classic Press. Rosemari, I thank you for the work that you're doing, and encourage the people to stay tuned to what is happening under this administration. It's so ironic that you have a country where that has fought for, as you said, self-determination and independence, and has also supported other countries. And then you have outside forces coming in to try and impact that and take that back. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. And just briefly, the fact that you want to invite Cuban writers to come to the events that you organize.
Yes,
they can't even
do.
get visas,
I know.
What does that mean for people to people for us here in this country?
Yes, we still have so much work to do. So I want to thank you again. I want to thank Fritz Richardson, my engineer. And remember, the writer's always reading, the reader's always writing. Keep reading and writing. Empower yourselves as readers and writers. Keep informed. Stay tuned. This is Dr. Brenda Green signing off.
Inspired by a poem written by Langston Hughes.